What is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and how do veterans experience it? How has our understanding of it changed over time? What insights about it can we glean from the humanities, literature, film, and history?
One of the people who has written about PTSD is Robert J. Lifton, a historian, psychohistorian, he's not psycho, he's a psychological historian, who says that one of the keys is what he says is the communalization of grief and the communalization of injury and the communalization of what's happening to veterans. And so I see this event as a kind of communalization, and I'm very thankful that so many people showed up to help communalize what we're going to talk about today. My own interest in this is that I taught at Davis before I retired a course on men's lives of men in America, so I've always done masculinity studies, did a book on the Boy Scouts and so on. But then a few years before I retired, I began a course called War in American Memory because we had nothing in the curriculum at Davis about wars, and certainly nothing, not only just about the war that was ongoing then in the middle of let's say 2005, but also beyond that. So that brought me into this, and so I have an interest in the masculinity and the American studies and so on as the background to the issues about veterans and PTSD. I'm going to introduce the panel, and after the introductions, we're going to ask them to give brief statements after everyone introduces himself and herself. And then we'll try to see some themes that will emerge from that and begin the discussion. To my immediate left is Brooklyn-born Bill Ludwig. He's a Vietnam veteran who was educated in that city and who served as an infantry platoon leader and small unit commander, participating in battles during the Tet Offensive in early 1968. Returning home late in '68, he earned an engineering and science degree from NYU and later attended the Pace College School of International Studies. Medical issues originating in his Vietnam service have plagued him for many years, and he is going to talk about that. Dr. Elisabeth McKenna is a clinical psychologist and family therapist for the Polytrauma Center of Care at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Palo Alto. She earned a Master of Education in Counseling Psychology from Cambridge College and a PhD in Clinical Psychology from Palo Alto University. She worked with trauma patients at a VA PTSD chronic day treatment program in Boston before working at the Palo Alto VA Hospital with a homeless rehabilitation program and a brain injury rehabilitation clinic at the hospital. She also has a private practice specializing in the treatment of PTSD. David Morris is a former Marine infantry officer and the author of Storm on the Horizon about the Gulf War Battle of Khafji. Did I pronounce that right? Khafji? From 2004 to 2007, he worked as an embedded reporter in Iraq. His writing has appeared in a wide range of media, from Slate and Salon to The New Yorker and the Los Angeles Times. In 2008, he was awarded a Creative Writing Fellowship from the NEA, and his book, The Evil Hours, a biography of post-traumatic stress disorder, will be released by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in January of 2015. One more thing before we begin the panel, just if you didn't get a white card in your packet, will you raise your hand so a staff member can get you a card? So we do want you to be able to ask some questions. Okay. When you do write the questions, try to keep them of a general nature so that they'll be of interest to the whole group. I am going to sort through them, but there are some questions I think will be of a more general nature and not very, very specific. Okay, our topic today is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the evolving understanding of the typical PTSD symptoms, re-experiencing traumatic events in dreams and flashbacks, increased arousal and hypervigilance, sudden outbursts of anger, and so on, began during and in the wake of World War I, the Great War, the centennial of which we're marking this month, the Guns of August. Then the syndrome was called shell shock. Military psychiatrists called the cluster of symptoms battle fatigue in World War II and Korea. And military psychiatrists called the cluster of symbols, once it was identified in Vietnam veterans, as post-traumatic stress disorder. And it finally appeared in the DSM-3, the diagnostic manual, in 1980. So it wasn't until 1980 that we actually had an official definition of PTSD. Boston therapist Jonathan Shea, with whom Elisabeth has worked, prefers to call the malady post-traumatic stress syndrome in order to avoid the disorder part, although he recognizes that the ship has sailed on that. And I, like another therapist, Edward Tick's use of the phrase soldier's heart, which was used in the American Civil War to describe these symptoms. Now, although there are veterans who suffer severe debilitating symptoms of PTSD, and we will talk about some of those, soldier's heart and other phrases meant to de-emphasize the disorder label, recognize that most returning veterans carry some version of the war within. That among the wounds carried by veterans are invisible wounds, wounds of the heart, wounds of the soul, wounds of character, wounds of identity. It is talk about the heart, the soul, character, and identity that invites the humanities into the discussion of PTSD. For that is an important part of the agenda for today's program, and in fact, for the year-long War Comes Home initiative. What can the humanities contribute to our understanding of the lives of veterans and their war within? How is their PTSD, whether severe or mild, connected to the rest of us? How are our cultural patterns, particularly the way we raise boys into men in this culture, contributing to the onset and persistence of PTSD? And what of the socialization of women who are playing increasingly dangerous roles in our military and suffering the added trauma of sexual assault from their comrades? How has literature, from Greek tragedy through Homer and on up through the present, described what it feels like to go to war? Shortly before I retired from Davis, I realized that neither I nor my colleagues in the humanities at Davis were articulating clearly to our students, especially in the general education courses, why we study the humanities at all. So the Davis Humanities Institute opened an online forum for people to try their hand at a brief statement about why the humanities are important. So here is my try at that statement, and then I'll pass it on to other people. We study the humanities so that we can have a fruitful discussion about what really counts in life, about the shared human search for meaning beyond mere subsistence and beyond merely getting through the day. Humans crave larger meanings in their lives, and they communicate these cravings, questions, and tentative answers through their expressive behavior, sometimes with words, sometimes with things like visual images, sometimes with music and dance and performance, sometimes with collective ritual or festival. The humanities examine big questions such as who are we, and why are we here, and what do we owe each other? Why is there suffering, and why is there beauty? How do cultural differences, honed by history and experience, shape particular expressions of what it means to be human? Can we learn from others across time and space the skill of living a most meaningful life as individuals and as a community? So that's our agenda. Let me ask Bill to start our discussion.
Good afternoon. I really appreciate all of you being here today, and I think that the key word about this whole discussion is understanding. Understanding what it is about mental illness that causes us all to look away, and also our just lack of incentive to put humanity first and everything else second. We are the species that inhabits the planet. My role here today is to be sort of an object lesson in a way of people who have experienced what everybody's talking about and be able to candidly talk to you about aspects of this that are real, happening every day, and that the people who come out of the military who have been in combat and have experienced the trauma that's involved are not the only ones affected. It becomes a disease, if you will, of the family, of the relationship with wives and children and husbands now with women in combat. And it is a serious, serious problem. As Jay just talked, it is not a new problem. It's just got a new name. And it goes back into the root causes of violence in the human community. And it goes back to why we do it and how we get there. And possibly it's a conversation about that it really, for mankind, meaning men, from the masculine side in particular, it is not necessarily the hype of media where they talk about patriotism. People who are 18 years old and 20 years old don't really think about patriotism. They go into war for the adventure and for the experience and for the travel and things like that. And this is an issue that needs to be explored and, again, understood so that you have the real implications of when people in positions of leadership make decisions about employing humanity as the shield against adversity, that one of the items that they consider all the time, we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that there should be a line item in every decision-making document that specifies the social cost of the decision that's about to be made. And that's basically my comment to open this discussion. It's a lot larger than talking about the hype in the media and the adventurous side or the exciting side of what combat is all about. Thank you.
So first off, I'd like to thank Cal Humanities for focusing attention on this really important issue. It's an honor and a privilege to be part of this panel today. And as hopefully this very long war comes to an end, we need to, it's crucially important that we educate ourselves, as Bill was saying, not only to what's happened, but to the current needs of the men and women who have fought our battle and the families who have sustained them through this very, very long and difficult war and will continue to sustain them. I need to make the announcement that anything I say today is my own personal view, my own personal opinion, and does not necessarily reflect the official policies and positions of my employer, the Veterans Health Administration. So if you have any problem, have any concerns, speak to me. Thanks.
So I guess just to reintroduce myself, my name is Dave Morris. I'm a former Marine infantry officer, and I spent some time in Iraq from 2004 to 2007 as an embedded reporter. I didn't have any introductory remarks necessarily prepared, but I wanted to talk just briefly about my experience with PTSD and my recent research project. And interestingly, and I want to talk for a minute about, we're talking about PTSD. It's 4 letters. It's an acronym that has become very much a part into the DNA of our culture. We understand, we view the world, we view film and music and literature often through the lens of PTSD, and we tend to see it everywhere in our culture, which I think is really interesting from a historian's point of view, because this is a new thing. PTSD was, in some historians' words, invented in 1980. It didn't exist prior to that. It was called shell shock, and there were various different names for it, but it never played such a central role in how we view veterans and how we view the identity of survivors. People today oftentimes tend to look at the very essence of what it means to be a survivor, to be a person grappling with this diagnosis, which is, as I mentioned, a relatively new thing. It's about as old as cable television. It's about as old as HBO, if you think about it from that standpoint. When I first came back from Iraq in 2004, I just I remember talking to one of my colleagues, and I just idly assumed that I had PTSD because it was such a common idiom. And over time, as I began looking into the origins of the diagnosis, I came to understand that it's not as common. It's actually a relative minority of troops, veterans have it, about 10 to 15%. And I think it's worth reminding this audience that it's a mistake to assume that anyone that comes back from war is going to have PTSD. When I was working on this book, I interviewed a number of people, mountain climbers, former prisoners of war, who surprisingly felt that it was awful, terrible, and traumatic, but in the end was actually a growth experience for many of them. And I know when I first was presented with that concept of post-traumatic growth, I was very skeptical, to say the least, but also mildly offended that someone would attempt to reinterpret this very awful series of events and make it and put some sort of American positive self-growth spin on it. But I'm here to tell you today that there are a great many people who come out of the underworld, who emerge from the underworld and the darkness of Iraq and Afghanistan, and a great many of them are my friends, and found that they are better human beings, more compassionate, more in touch with the world, have a larger heart, not to mention a larger head, a larger intellect, and in some senses, I consider myself to be in those ranks. So I guess today my interests and my continuing interests in PTSD are how it has evolved over time, and the reasons for which and the ways in which it's become so important to us as Americans and as people living through this war on terror era, which I think is how historians will look back at this 10-year period of time. They will probably look back at this period as the war on terror time. So that's about all I had to say, just for starters.
Okay. Would Bill or Elisabeth like to respond to what other people have said? Okay, since you got to go first.
Yeah, okay. I guess what I'll say is I absolutely agree with what Dave just said. And one of the things that needs to be considered with those of us who have been diagnosed with a chronic PTSD is that I absolutely have benefited from the experience, okay? But it took me 40 years to really recognize that I was a stronger person for it and that I was better at addressing it because, and that was brought out by those two folks over there who are my counselors at the VA. And I have lived with them, or they have lived with me for the better part of 5 or 6 years now. And that's the reason that I'm able to sit up here and talk about all this stuff, because they took a life that was absent of reality and changed it into something that was realistic and able to step back into a normal lifestyle. Anyway, with all of that, that's the comment I have to make. And as far as Elisabeth's comment, probably the big problem was, what we started to talk about, is that there was a lack of recognition and communication at the time of the Vietnam War of services that were available. And I came out of the Vietnam War not even knowing that the VA really existed, okay? And to their credit, they have learned, like the rest of us, through science and technology and just understanding that this is a definite problem. And like I said earlier, that its origination is probably, when the first humans hit the beach, and so anyway, that'll be my comment.
I want Elisabeth to respond, but I should say that there is a project that's a couple of years old now called Theater of War, in which actors were touring around reading. There was a pair of Greek tragedies that have to do with war. We don't think about this, but all the Greek playwrights were soldiers too, because if you were in Greece, you were a soldier. And so PTSD is so clear in these plays that they toured around doing readers' theater versions of these plays. So it's very, very old.
Well, I think that one of the things that I have appreciated over the last 26 years that I've been a therapist is the reduction of stigma around mental illness in general and PTSD specifically, which has caused a lot of veterans from earlier conflicts to come forward. We've seen at the VA a huge increase in diagnoses among earlier veterans from earlier conflicts. And that's very gratifying because the reality is there are effective treatments available, and veterans, even who have suffered with PTSD a long time, do well. So definitely the message is one of hope, that if you are one of the minority, but definitely a significant group who do carry PTSD, to go forward and get help.
Well, I think at this point it can be useful to sort of review briefly the history of PTSD and where it came from. And Jay mentioned Robert J. Lifton, who, along with a couple other people who were New York City psychiatrist, Hy Shatton, who worked at NYU, were some of the first people that began to push for a diagnosis, which later became PTSD. And interestingly, one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that PTSD emerged from the political context of Vietnam. If there hadn't been such a controversial war that created such a social backlash, and the Bay Area obviously plays a significant role in that. In Northern California, it was one of the hotbeds of the insurgency against the war. And the whole concept of having a medical diagnosis that was based around the opposition and the idea that war can have a poisoning effect on human beings was a new idea. And this is something that came out of the 1970s and the clash of cultures that was happening at that time. And so it's worthwhile to consider how the diagnosis has changed. And we're talking about how the stigma, how it's been largely destigmatized, which is interesting. Because and I think the military and the VA has done a very good job of normalizing it, of making it something that we expect people to wrestle with. The idea, and in terms of nomenclature, I'm sort of a proponent of using PTS, post-traumatic stress, and I'll use PTSD, the terminology, because it's sort of an agreed upon. It's a lexicon. It's a word we all know, but I think among the Iraq vets I know and the mountaineers that I know that have struggled with this, they prefer, among themselves, to oftentimes just use the term PTS because it does actually carry less stigma. But it's interesting to me that because of the politics of the Vietnam War and having this diagnosis, we've been able to have this agreed upon lexicon, this idiom of distress, this idiom of loss that we call PTSD. And people are even now looking back and discovering PTSD in Lawrence of Arabia and T.E. Lawrence. I was just reading about that in a great book, Lawrence in Arabia, where he had nightmares and struggled with his identity after World War I. And so you can find aspects of it in historical figures. But I briefly did want to mention that it is, interestingly, PTSD is not acknowledged by everyone in the historical community. And there are people, a number of British historians, that think it is essentially a social fiction that's been foisted upon veterans and has turned people from survivors into victims. And there is sort of this clash of ideas of, PTSD. Is it, can you really institutionalize loss in that way? Can you institutionalize trauma and medicalize this, sort of immortal condition? To which, and I'm sort of in between the two camps, but the research that I did, I discovered there's a very good writer, Jared Diamond, who has written a number of bestsellers, Gun, Germs, and Steel, and just came out with a book called The World Before Yesterday, in which he studies very closely and spends a great deal of time with the tribes of New Guinea, which is a remote southern Pacific island. And the tribes of New Guinea are generally thought to be some of the most well-preserved tribal societies from antiquity, from the dawn of human history. And he found in interviewing warriors from New Guinea, tribes of New Guinea, that warriors do have nightmares post-battle. So we have and the nightmares oftentimes focus around being left alone in the battlefield, being abandoned, and in some way not being a part of the team. And so we do have evidence, that as far back as the dawn of time, that there is something essential to the human condition that responds, that is not necessarily damaged, but is changed by warfare and changed by trauma. And one other note on with Jared Diamond, which I think is of interest, is that within the tribal societies of New Guinea, there is more, it is okay for a warrior to return from battle and brag about it and say, I slayed 7 men in battle and I killed them this way. That is not something that is done in America. That is not something that is done in the West today. That is something that is, killing is looked at as something, is basically licensed murder. And so that is, I think, one of the major cultural changes that informs why PTSD among veterans expresses itself the way it does today, in the sense that there is a fear of veterans, there is a stigma, there is Jonathan Shea in his book Achilles in Vietnam refers to it as a form of blood pollution, because people come back from war and they may not necessarily have killed people personally, but they have been in where the killing was done. And so that changes in all societies across history. People that kill, or are involved in slaughter or are involved in meat packing are treated in a slightly different way and are looked at as belonging to a different caste of society. So that the industrialization and the way that the West looks at killing today is part of the reason PTSD expresses itself the way it does, with people with veterans that have a sort of a tough time explaining their experiences or decompressing them.
A couple of things that you said that reminded me of things. One, of course, is the stigma that was attached to Vietnam vets by all the Vietnam War films, which essentially had characters of Vietnam veterans who were crazy people and were murderous and violent and so on and so forth. But if I could get people to respond to this point, and that is several of the people therapists and others who write about PTSD, say things like this. First of all, for example, that PTSD is a normal human reaction to an abnormal situation. That is, instead of thinking of PTSD as an abnormality, it really is quite an effective response to a situation. It's just the problem comes when you carry it back into another situation. And the other point which interests me from my American Studies point of view, and I'd like to hear people talk about, is the sense that the symptoms of PTSD, some of the symptoms of PTSD shown by men, a kind of emotional neutrality, a withdrawal, an aggressiveness, and so on, are in fact the characteristics that are valued in men in American culture. That is, we really are just talking about sort of masculine identity traits. And so, which is why I think Marlantes at the end of his book says, if we want to change things, we have to really think about how we're socializing the children, especially the boys. So that throws out a couple of issues, but I'm interested in this fact that the PTSD really is a symptom of the culture. There's a larger cultural thing that's going on that PTSD is pointing to.
I'm not sure if this really responds to what you're saying, but the reality is that men are not the only people in war who experience PTSD. Children experience PTSD. Women do, non-combatants, civilians do. So it's not just the act of being a warrior that produces the PTSD or symptoms of PTSD. You said something earlier about, is it adaptive? Well, the reality is that, some working theory of PTSD is that you're in a heightened adrenaline state, and in essence, you act before you think, and that is very adaptive in a combat situation. And so, in a sense, that is, but then that kind of hyper-arousal is not adaptive in a civilian situation. So, you'll have veterans talk about, 1 minute I was okay, the next minute I was putting my fist through the wall, and I don't know what happened. I mean, I know I got mad, but I didn't make a decision to do that. And so, in a sense, part of the therapy is slowing that down and reversing, in a sense, that wiring that has someone act before they think.
As a therapist, what are the tools that you give the patients you talk to, tools for dealing with that?
There are many. So the VA has what they call evidence-based practices or therapies that are used. The two most common are CPT, or cognitive processing therapy, or PE, prolonged exposure. Both, as I said, are evidence-based, and ongoing research is done, and there's good research to support it. I personally use something called EMDR, which is also used at some VA facilities. And in my private practice, I treat all kinds of trauma, including clergy abuse, incest, rape, other assault, physical abuse, so as well as combat trauma. So mindfulness is a huge component to therapy. I mean, Bill can probably speak to some of the strategies that have worked for him.
Well, I think that it's another comment I'll just make is that there's a huge human-to-human contact element to all of this, and that there's a bonding that occurs between the therapist and the patient, and that if that initial trust is not established and that mutual concern, it fails, because it's just one of those things where the person who is a patient and needs to voluntarily make a decision to trust the therapist enough where they will tell them anything. They've gone through years and years of not telling anybody anything, being unwilling to talk about it like I did. I started talking about my experiences in Vietnam to my family only 5 years ago. Okay? And in that regard, my therapists know everything there is to know. And one of the key elements of what we did in the trauma treatment, if you want to call it that, is we actually identified all of the traumatic things that we did, all of the things we had guilt about, all the things that we regretted in the dismantling, as we said about earlier. I had a wonderful childhood, a very supportive family, German father / Irish mother, Catholic upbringing and everything. And the experience in the war, okay, dismantled one by one all of the values that were given to me by that upbringing. And so then you arrive at a point where your life is questionable. You don't know who you are. You start looking in the mirror thinking you're a bad person. And this is all side effects, and it's clinical. And it really, for today's program, which is directed not so much at the clinical environment, but supposedly at the gaining understanding, okay? We could talk all day about the negative impacts on family and children and all of the things that you do without knowing it that causes hurt to people that you should care about most. The fact of the matter is to gain understanding is that this is an integral part, the macho outlook, how men are brought up in society, whether it be fanatical football fans or overly aggressive hockey players or any of that. It's embedded in how we develop as men and as women. The expectation is that we are going to fix it, and we are going to solve it, and we are going to protect, and we are going to do all of this stuff. And yes, you know, the perspective of women is changing, and rightfully so. And they are better at a lot of things than we are. And because we get caught up in the emotion of being aggressive. And in the military, from the day you arrive in a combat unit, you are taught to kill. You don't like to hear that. You don't want to tell that to your mother or your father necessarily. Your father probably knows. But that's what you're taught to do. And so from day one, you're starting to dismantle your core values. And within that sphere, the longer you stay in that environment, the more you change. Nobody wants to talk about it, but when we, as human beings, look at another human being and take away that person's life, it changes you forever. Everybody will tell you, well, it's justified. I will tell you, you're still doing it to another human being, a person that is connected to you in the species. And so, if there's any hope for the future, there has to be an understanding of that, of what it is you're doing, and cause some sort of generational changes or whatever, cultural changes, to recognize that the human community is whole and it's universal and there are good people everywhere.
One of the things I imagine that people in the audience may want to know is, how do you speak to a veteran? Because, you know, in terms of what you've just said, I know that veterans say the thing that you don't ask a veteran is, did you kill anybody?
Mm-hmm. Which will nevertheless happen. I had students, numerous people, and I know other Iraq vets, that's like one of their biggest complaints. And it's hard to, I don't know if people, if there's some, that I think it's one of the core things that happens. There's not an understanding of that, how deeply offensive that is to ask that question. And there's the fact that the question, regardless of the answer, the fact that that question is repeatedly posed is so offensive and so gets to the heart, I think, of what you were saying about American culture, is that we have an obsession with violence. And this is my personal beef, is I hate first-person shooter video games where you see all that gore and blood. And there is this desensitization towards violence and this interest in this prurient, obscene, disgusting interest in, like, what's it like to kill somebody. The snipers I know that have dumped people, that have killed people, turned their lights out, it's the most private, thing, the event that has ever happened to them. It's the last thing they're ever going to talk about. And it's the last thing that snipers and Marines, whomever, soldiers, don't sit around and talk about dudes they whacked. It's such an intimate affair that question, and the fact that it is repeatedly posed. If you had to boil down veterans PTSD, that's very, very close to the core of what it is. That lack of communication, the fact that the world at home is its own world and the war world is another world, and those two worlds don't communicate. And and the veterans caught in between those two worlds. And the burden, I know I'm going on too long here, but the burden, for some reason, even though this person nominally serves this world, the burden of understanding and of growth and of change is put on the veteran. He or she has to do it, even though she is serving the world, is serving the civilian world. It's really curious because the pressure comes down on that individual rather than the society doesn't really embrace the burden. It's from what I've seen.
If I had a wish, it would be that anyone who really felt in their heart that they wanted to support our troops or support veterans, that they commit to reading at least one book about what it's like
Amen.
to go to war. It's so critical. That's a great one to start with, but there are lots of them. And as was mentioned, Marlentis was a Vietnam veteran, and there are some differences between the Vietnam War and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think it's so important. And if you have someone in your life who truly is not willing to read, I mean, Marlentis's book is available as an audiobook, so you can listen to it. I bet this library has it for you to loan out, to borrow. And then there are also some really great films. And War Torn is a documentary on PTSD that's about an hour long, which is a place you can start. And there are other documentaries that are, if you want to know about military sexual trauma, which is estimated 20% of women serving have experienced, and probably 3% of men, but that means there are more men than women because of the sheer numbers. The Invisible War is a great documentary to watch. It's not enough to say thank you for your service. That really is not enough. We really need to understand, we need to learn, we need to increase our compassion, and that comes from knowledge.
Yeah, David Finkel's book, Thank You for Your Service, sort of begins with the notion that may be not the thing to say anymore to veterans, because thank you for your service just becomes this phrase that people use to say, okay, thank you for your service, we're not going to talk about this now. We're going to move on to something else. And so I think people are still, whatever advice all three of you have about people in the audience who meet a vet for the first time or something like that, what do you think the vet wants? How does the vet want them to react to the fact that they're veterans?
I'm going to let the two veterans say how they prefer to be asked or acknowledged or whatever, but I would say, as all of us, as citizens, as voters, we need to support the important programs that help veterans. There are many in your community, and as citizens, we need to support things like veterans courts, which are crucial for helping veterans who experience, often, it's estimated 39% of incarcerated veterans screen positive for PTSD. 39%. And my first paid job was at a men's medium security prison as a counselor in Massachusetts. And over again, I saw people who were there because they hadn't been helped. They were Vietnam veterans with PTSD who hadn't been helped. And so, all of us are charged with that.
Dave and Bill, what do you think veterans would like people to do when they find out you're a veteran?
I'm such a weirdo. I feel like such a strange veteran in a way. I'm a pretty unusual former jarhead. But I guess I was a history major, and I'm always interested in the history of with respect to Iraq in particular. Right now, ISIS, is in the process of unraveling 100 years of history. The modern Middle East was written by one of the reasons the wars happened and the world we're living in was caused by one treaty, the Sykes-Picot Treaty. A French foreign minister and the English foreign minister got together in secret and redrew the map of the Middle East. And they're in the process of wiping all those borders away. So I like it if someone wants to talk about Iraq, read Lawrence in Arabia. It's a great book. Or see that movie and learn about how the Middle East worked. Because when I went to Iraq in 2003, it was the middle of the Anbar Awakening and the Surge, which I'm not a big fan of that whole narrative, the Surge. But the whole Anbar Awakening was about tribal engagement, and the productive things and the things that we did in Iraq that were useful were about engaging locals on their cultural turf and understanding what they want and understanding the dynamics of Iraqi tribes, which required an understanding of their history. And I'm not trying to advocate for U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine or anything like that, but actually understanding the history, because Iraqis have this very strange thing that they do. They actually remember what happened to their people 100 years ago as if it happened yesterday, which Americans absolutely do not do. And so to understand Iraqis, you have to understand what, their view of the world is very tribal. And so I like to talk about, okay, so did you see, how did the Iraqis look at this? And did they try to convert you? Or some sort of, cultural conversation. And I love talking about the Marine Corps and all the crazy mythology and that stuff, but, it's got to be, I prefer, I agree, if you read one book, read Tom Rick's Fiasco, read The Forever War by Dexter Filkins, The Thin Red Line by James Jones, sit there and read a book and have some sort of, ask an emotionally intelligent question. And I have to say one very unpopular comment. I'm from San Diego, which is a big craft beer capital, and some of the best conversationalists I've met about veterans are bartenders and people that make craft beer, because they go, bro, how's it going, man? And they want to talk, and they just want to have this is going to sound stupid, but like a bro-to-bro conversation, and like, dude, I feel like, and this one craft beer guy who was a brewmaster at Stone Brewing, he said, I just feel like I feel this obligation because I can tell these guys have been waiting a really, really long time to just kind of unload some of this crap. And so those guys, it was really amazing. And he was like, yeah, I just want to be there for them. And, sort of the cliched bartender as therapist kind of deal. But I felt it was this one guy that I met and talked to for 10 minutes. And I felt like he was invested in like trying to have a genuine exchange, and he wasn't looking for a soundbite from me or from the people. He felt like he got something.
I know what you mean. So. My father was a bartender. And in fact, he spent all of World War II being a bartender in an officers club in Miami Beach, Florida. I'll let you have the last word, Bill, on what veterans would like, how when someone comes up and finds out you're a veteran conversation, is there a way that you'd like them to relate to you after they find out?
Well, I think that I really agree with a lot of what Dave said just now. The Vietnam thing is filled with so much negative feelings, politics, all that sort of thing, that it's like overdone. It's been around for a long time, and I'd rather have sincere conversations. What was it like from a people's standpoint? I think one of the things that struck us when we were there was that just like he was talking about with the Iraqis in Vietnam, people, the average person, the guy that had the grass hut on the side of the edge of the rice paddy, he and his family had been there for hundreds of years, and they had been participating or they had been victimized by war for 30, 40 years, all of that. French were there before we were there. And yet, when you met them individually, they'd call you in to share their dinner. They would talk to you, friendly people, just like today. If you go to Vietnam and you go to Saigon or any place like that, the Vietnamese love Americans, okay? And so it's a testament, as far as I'm concerned, about the connection between the human community, the participants in the community. And so that's what I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk about a future that's all-inclusive and recognizes that the good people of the world are, an expression I use a lot is that there's many of them. The problem is that they're surrounded by bad guys, and you need to get over the bad guys to get at the good people. And there are good people everywhere, and that's what I'd like to talk about.
We're at that moment where if you have written down a question, Alicia and the other staff members will collect them, get them to me, and while that is happening, I want to thank everyone for the initial conversation we've had. We'll have more because your questions will possibly be aimed at particular people on the panel, but also at some of the larger questions. I like the idea that came up in this last exchange about essentially you want to know how to approach a veteran is you learn something. I mean, this is the humanities, right? You read a book, you watch a movie, you learn something.
Sorry, did that turn into a paid promotional announcement? Go team.
Go books, go books. I hope you all will take part in this project, the reading project, because I think, and as Elisabeth said, there are many, believe me, I've read hundreds of memoirs. There are many very good memoirs of war, and I'm sure that your librarian can help you, and actually, Cal Humanities can give you a reading list, give you some ideas and some suggestions as well, I believe. Okay. So, doing my Phil Donahue. Some of you are old enough to remember Phil Donahue, right?
Jay, I wanted to make one comment. One thing I think that can be helpful, if you talk to a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine about like what they're doing with their lives, they like to talk about the how, and they're like, yeah, I'm in 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, we're at Camp San Mateo, I'm a machine gunner, this is my job, and they're like really into the practical aspects of, indirect fire and, all the techniques and stuff. So if you can learn a little bit, and I'm always surprised, like, I would live in Southern California, and I was stationed at Camp Pendleton, and you would meet people that lived 10 miles away and had no idea that the oldest, most decorated, regiment in the whole Marine Corps was 10 minutes from their house, and that it had fought in World War I and been, awarded medals by the French, and it had all of this huge, tons of history was all condensed in this one place, and they had no idea that it was, what units were there, what they did, where they had been. My old battalion had fought at Way City, Fallujah, and Sangin, Afghanistan, and all of had so much history clustered, among these 1,000 men, and you don't get the sense that the unit lineage or the basics of the history is sort of, if there's even an interest among civilians for that. And I think, and that was, and honestly, like some of the, when I was in treatment and when I was dealing with the VA, I didn't get a sense that, and this is, every VA center is different, but I didn't get a real great sense that they even understood sort of the basics of what okay, you were an 0302 infantry officer, this is what you did. I didn't get a sense that their knowledge was what it should have been. So that's kind of my thing.
Well, one of the differences between this war and previous wars is that this war has been fought by the smallest percentage of the U.S. population, and whereas in Vietnam and Korea, everyone knew someone who was fighting, maybe a cousin, maybe, someone's dad, maybe your brother. This war, there's so many people who have no connection to it whatsoever, and that just means, since we now have had more than 2 million people served, we need to know what they experienced. And if you aren't part of a military family, you need to educate yourself.
I think one other comment I would make is that someone asked me at some point in time about could I compare the campaigns in Iraq and the campaign in Afghanistan with the Vietnam War, and talk about how I felt about the relative impact on the participants. In other words, I feel that the stress levels and the impact on the personal lives of the people that serve in Iraq and Afghanistan is far greater than what was existing in Vietnam. Even though we talk about Vietnam more, because of the political and the historical stuff that went on in the country. And the reason I say that is because Iraq and Afghanistan are very different, because the participants are coming from, in many cases, they came from reserve units. They came from people being sent over who had to leave not only their families, but their regular careers. They had to make multiple trips over there, tours, and all of that. And that wasn't the case in Vietnam. Okay, you could volunteer for multiple tours. Sometimes you got sent back, but it was over a much longer span of time. And I think that the participants from those reserve units and the people had much, much greater impact on the stresses involved, particularly in family life and work life, and the interruptions associated with that.
Yeah, briefly, I was in a cognitive processing therapy, group therapy, with this Marine from my old unit who'd done 7 deployments, 7-month deployments. He'd done 49 months in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And I met another Marine, similar
and
unit.
think about people who have professional careers, and somebody that goes through the normal, what we call the normal life of, they go to school, they go to high school, they go to college, they get a degree, and they elect a profession, okay? And then right in the middle of that professional growth, you disappear. So you lose your place in the hierarchy of what it takes to progress in business or wherever you go, and you get interrupted. And then at the end of that interruption, you come back and you're behind. You're behind, and the world has changed. Something has changed. The political whatever in a corporation is different because they have different staff or whatever. And all of a sudden, your value as a professional is no longer calculated the same. It's less because you're no longer integrated into that society. And I think that's a major thing that needs to be addressed in terms of evaluating these folks, because the stresses on wives taking care of children, wives trying to pay bills, wives trying to do all of this stuff, and other family members too. And these are all of the social consequences that I talked about earlier. When decisions are made, I said to somebody earlier, we're still paying for World War II.
Well, one of the, I'm going to come to your cards now. And one of the cards actually mentions the fact that there was that whole generation of World War II soldiers who came back and with PTSD, and there was no discussion ever about PTSD. And those fathers, some mothers, but those fathers raised the generation of baby boomers to have certain attitudes about, repressed feelings, workaholism, a whole bunch of things that we saw in the 1950s that, I guess Mad Men itself, Don Draper in Mad Men is sort of our number one example here, right? Is part of the payment. That is a whole generation of men, of daughters and sons raised by veterans who couldn't talk about this and didn't get any help with this, and so on. I see a couple, forgive me if I don't get to your card because we're doing this in a very short period of time, but I see some patterns, and so I'm going to try to identify some of those patterns in the cards. The one was about the cost. A couple of people have been interested in the question of what can we do to make people more resilient, if we want to and if we can, make people more resilient when they're in stressful situations. Marlantes, as I said, does talk about the fact we have to rethink the way in which we raise children around violence and other things. But what are the other ways in which people can become resilient?
Well, the military, the Department of Defense, is doing a lot of research in terms of building resilience, and perhaps, David, you can speak about that if you were part of that training. I know that we do know some things about humans' response to stress, and we are designed to deal with stress. The problem is high levels, unremitted stress. And so these multiple deployments, you have a greater chance of developing a problem when you have multiple deployments, when you don't have enough breaks, when you don't have the support that you need so that if you are feeling you're at the breaking point, you can remove yourself from the situation. certainly it's possible to teach mindfulness and other techniques that can help people center and kind of reduce the response, the fear, fight, flight response, or freeze response. So, there are things that we can definitely do. Receive some of that?
Not resilience training as it's conceived of today, although I'm familiar with some of the ideas behind it. I just wanted to say quickly, PTSD is a disease of time. And there's an interesting article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine about 4 years ago, where they found out that within about 48 hours after a traumatic event, say an earthquake or rape, if you give someone a beta blocker, propranolol, that can actually disrupt the traumatic, the overconsolidation of that memory within the brain. And they found that soldiers that were given morphine and were knocked out after an IED strike, for example, had 50% less likelihood of getting post-traumatic stress in the wake of that. So there is something that happens, and I'm not a huge proponent of neuroscience and what it has to say about PTSD. I think it's oversold to a large degree. I think PTSD is more a question of culture than biology. But with respect to the rehearsal of memory and the way memories are created with respect to emotion, there are ways to disrupt the overconsolidation of fear memories in the brain, in the amygdala. And that work's been done here in the UC system. And interestingly, they went back, this researcher with the Naval Health Research Institute in San Diego went back and they looked at, okay, who got morphine, who didn't, who got PTSD, who didn't. And they found there was a 50% reduction if the soldier or Marine was knocked out with morphine. So there is something about the memory consolidation process within about 48 hours that if you can disrupt it, that will reduce that autonomic, that fight or flight response aspect of PTSD.
And there's something interesting about that. The unit that I work on are folks who have, I work with active duty folks who have experienced serious injuries. And oftentimes, when that's the case, they actually don't have PTSD from the actual event because they were knocked out and given morphine, but they develop it because one of the things that's happened in this war, I don't think it happened in Vietnam, soldiers, Marines often have cameras. And so, I know of one Marine who actually saw himself being blown up over and over again because it was filmed by one of his buddies. That is not helpful. That is, so it is possible to get PTSD not from the actual event. Many people develop symptoms of PTSD watching the events of 9/11 over and over again. So, we have to be careful as human beings what we expose ourselves to.
Yeah, that's why I don't really go to action movies anymore. I had an event where there was a very realistic IED scene in Iron Man, the movie, and I don't remember it because I left the theater and woke up like 10 seconds later. So that's sort of like, and if you look at the history of PTSD and trauma, technology is the transformer of trauma. World War I and high explosive, that was where we got shell shock from. The flashback and the way we think about trauma now is so heavily influenced by action films and by video games. And so many combat troops I've talked to, when you ask them about some firefight they were in or some extended contact or ambush, they'll say it was just like Black Hawk Down. So many people will say that. The movie Black Hawk Down, that will say it was just like that movie. And so there is, and guys will rewatch their IED videos, and I can't. There are some, like I tried to watch Black Hawk Down again to use that example, and I couldn't watch it. And there's something about film that because realism is the films are made so realistically, and they do such a good job at it that it can. It's interesting you say that because that was sort of my experience is that film. It puts me back in that place.
And often it's very hard to get people to stop watching. But as a psychologist who treats PTSD, stop watching. It doesn't do us any good. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned so far, Jay, is traumatic brain injury or mild traumatic brain injury, often a result of IEDs and blast waves, etc. And the symptoms almost completely match those of PTSD, and it's very difficult to sort those out. And again, oftentimes the PTSD symptoms are made worse by what people do in response.
Bill, did you want to respond to the resilience question?
Just as a side issue, I was blessed with both. I have the PTSD and the traumatic brain injury. But I will say that I don't think there's necessarily yet, a clear answer as to how you can manage this, okay? Because this is all about not, to my knowledge, based on what I know, there's no real cure. This is not going to go away. You're not going to forget the events that you participated in, and the ideal solution is to gain enough self-confidence and understanding of what this is all about such that you can consciously manage your own behavior. And I think that that's the best of all worlds, and that has worked for me. That doesn't mean on any given day I don't have anger, I don't have, moments of depression or withdrawal or any of those things, but the objective is to manage it so that you can make the best out of the life you have. And I think that, the VA released in the past 2 weeks 3,000 pages of research on PTSD. And to me, they're the people, together with the other people that are knowledgeable about this from a clinical standpoint and a medical standpoint and a humanities standpoint, they're the people that should keep doing what they're doing because they're making solid progress, and you can rely on them. And I look at the VA and the work they do as having saved my life. And I think, and the people that are in the front lines of the VA, like Elisabeth, like those folks over there who are my counselors, they work night and day to provide the kind of services that are required. And we're fortunate in this area for having Mather and the other area and the other places in California, which do an outstanding job on the medical side. And I feel I'm a testament to that because I had no support whatsoever in terms of a medical community that I could rely on until 5 years ago. And I'm 71. And so for 40 years or 45 years, it was, a do-it-yourself thing.
A number of the questions have to do with putting together character, putting together, as you were talking about, sort of you were one kind of person when you were 19 or 20.
Yeah.
You had the war experience come back. It really is a wound of character, a soul wound, as Tick says. Does anyone have any sort of quick thing they can say about this whole issue of sort of character? Because really what we're talking about is a situation where we're putting young people, young men and women both, very often when they're at the moment where they still haven't completely formed their character, and we're putting them in a character transforming situation.
Yeah, I guess I say something quickly. I guess that was sort of what I was gesturing towards with my first comments, is I think it's interesting. PTSD is a new thing, and the idea of us treating it in a manner that is vaguely similar to how we would treat strep throat, i.e. by physicians in a hospital setting, I think is kind of strange, and we have to admit that that's a new thing. And I think we have to accept the fact that psychiatry and psychology has in many ways replaced the priest, the shaman, and the poet. And I think the wounds and the struggles, and not all veterans come back morally or psychologically wounded, but the struggles, which are existential, philosophical, core issue, human issues, I personally, and this is going to be another unpopular thing, I don't look to psychiatry for answers for those things. I look to literature, I look to poetry, I look to, I'm not a religious person, but I do look to, I started reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, which a lot of veterans recommended to me, as like how to recenter your thinking, how to reframe yourself cognitively to think about living in the present instead of living in the past. So I don't, Personally, I think that's what's interesting, and sort of the exterior, the scaffolding around the idea of talking about PTSD. We're talking about a psychiatric concept that I think only is just the tip of the iceberg, because there's all the rest of the stuff beneath the waterline that the person's going through. And so I don't, the people I've talked to at the VA, I thought were well trained in a set of protocols and a way of treating the trauma, but I didn't personally think they had a lot of moral insight or a lot of philosophical insight. And they never, not once was I encouraged to look at it as a growth experience. So that's sort of one thing, I want to put out there, is I'm not sure. The VA is way better than they were in the 70s when at the end of the Vietnam War. And that is because of the generation of advocates that put together the PTSD concept. We're in a much better place than we were. But I think some of the VA's therapies are actually wrong-headed. I think they're philosophically misinformed. And I'm not convinced that the VA is exactly where it needs to be. There's a lot of smarter people that are much smarter than me, working harder and putting in longer hours than I am. But it's not simply a matter of access to me. I think there's some, and it's sort of outside the realm of this discussion, but I think there are some things that the VA are doing are actually destructive.
Well, Elisabeth?
Well, obviously the VA is a huge medical system, and it doesn't sound like your experiences have been as positive as Bill's has. I certainly, in my work, bring in all of the other areas that you describe. And as a family therapist, I'm working with couples primarily who are dealing with PTSD, both with the, it could be either partner or both. There are a lot of dual military couples out there, and often with children who are trying to manage their lives with a parent who has PTSD. So, I think the VA, it's impossible to characterize such a big system. There's so many different areas, but certainly we have at our facility in Palo Alto programs that use art and music and writing.
Yeah, I don't want to come across as shooting the VA in the face necessarily. I'm not saying the VA needs to be abolished, but I guess, and this is something I get into at length in the book, is I think there are, and this gets down to the way the communication within the VA and in society is conceptualized. The veteran is someone who is generally spoken to. They are allowed to tell their stories, but their stories are looked at as too toxic to hear. And I feel like oftentimes veterans are told to stick to the protocol, tell your story, and this is true for prolonged exposure. Tell your story the way we want you to tell it. And the veteran is not, there is not a lot of freedom and wisdom making or sort of reflective thinking encouraged on the part of veterans. It's medicalized, and that's, I'm trying to think of a way, we want to end on a positive note, but that's something.
Well, I think the positive note is that and I can only speak from my personal experience, is that one of the comments I made when we first started the conversation was that I felt that the key element in terms of the treatment was the human relationship. I can tell you that the programs that I went through were not medical in terms of that. Maybe it was, I got into it before they made the changes into whatever they're doing now, and I'm not aware of that. The program that I went through was very, very personalized. I had total freedom. I participated in roundtable discussions, and I shared with the people in the room, and we shared with one another everything that we did and everything that we participated in and all of our personal reactions. And part of the thing was we wrote personal letters to all of the people we felt we offended and all of that. And I had so much freedom, as a matter of fact, that Dr. Schneider and Dr. Keenan over there know basically every aspect of my life. And I am forever grateful for that, because I guess we could go back and we can say, you know, the VA is, in my opinion, is not necessarily the bad guy here, okay? Yes, it's an organization and it's filled with all people like us. And, you know, patients and physicians and all of that. And you cannot, you know, evaluate the whole system based on necessarily experiences with a small sample of who's there. I will say again that the frontline people who are treating us, I find to be extraordinary. And I'm sure that's not the same in Phoenix, the thing that was in the paper the other day, or places like that. But I can tell you, for the people that I've been associated with that helped me through this, I am eternally grateful.
And I have more to say on that, I guess. I don't want to dissuade the conversation.
Well, we are out of time. And I apologize to not getting to a lot of the questions. There are a lot of cards, a lot of questions. Some of the cards were asking about the books that have been mentioned here. And so, where's Alicia? Hello. Can we get can we put a list of books up on the Cal Humanities website on all these topics? All right, we'll work on that. The website address of calhum.org is on the back of this program. So if you hang on to this, you'll have that website, because I think all of us on the panel, but then other people who have been thinking and writing and reading about this, can actually make up a little reading list, because the humanities part of this has been to go out there and read, right? Go out there and watch some films, watch some documentaries. Elisabeth mentioned some really good documentaries to help you understand what's going on with PTSD and so on. Thank you immensely for your attentiveness. Again, I apologize. I feel bad that we didn't get to that many questions, because there was a big stack of interesting questions here. But I now am going to turn it over to Vanessa Wang, who has a few final comments.
Can we have a round of applause for this terrific panel?
This program was one of 5 public conversations exploring different facets of the veteran experience conducted during the summer of 2014 as part of War Comes Home, a Cal Humanities statewide initiative to open minds to the critical issues veterans face when coming home from war. How should communities welcome service members back? How can we build bridges of understanding between those who have served and those who have not? For more information, visit www.calhum.org. Public Conversations is a project of Cal Humanities in partnership with the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the California State Library, and California Public Libraries. It is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Bay Tree Fund, the Whitman Institute, and the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services under the provisions of the Library Services and Technology Act, administered in California by the State Librarian. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording do not necessarily represent those of Cal Humanities, the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the California State Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Bay Tree Fund, or the Whitman Institute.